Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to Episode 6 of Countdown to GDPR. This is a podcast where, with Jonathan Armstrong, partner at Cordery in London, we take a look at the new GDPR and how it will affect companies here in the United States. Today, we take a little bit different direction as Jonathan and I are interviewed by Laura Petrolino. Laura is with the consulting firm of Arment Dietrich that helps companies in their social media and PR offerings. She interviews us about GDPR from the communicator/PR/social media perspective and what U.S. companies involved in those businesses need to do to prepare for GDPR. However, it's much broader, and I think we'll give you a very good flavor of the different types of regulations and the different types of business responses that companies can and should make. It's a fascinating exploration of GDPR from a little bit different angle than we normally take. I know you will enjoy it. Countdown to GDPR is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
I have the pleasure of having two wonderful gentlemen here with me who do have the answers to those questions that we can talk to a little bit further about this regulation and how it will affect you as a communications pro. So, gentlemen, would you please introduce yourselves briefly for our audience?
So I'm Tom Fox, and I'm actually a good friend of someone who knows a lot about GDPR. I can spell GDPR, and that is in many ways the top level of my expertise in the subject matter. But I will allow my friend, who is the true subject matter expert, to introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Armstrong. I'm with Cordery in London. We do a lot of GDPR-related work. I've been doing data protection work since the early 90s, despite my youthful appearance.
Wonderful. And we will have links to Jonathan's website and some of the webinars that these two have done on GDPR in the blog post as well, so you can follow up with additional information. And Tom, it's always good to, stick with people that are the experts. So you're right ahead with that. Okay, so let's get started. So the first question is, when you're looking at businesses that are currently dealing with this issue, what do you think are the top 3 areas where businesses are not currently GDPR compliant?
It seems to me that the first thing, the almost, and by the way, there is a bushel in the corner of the room that Tom's light is currently hidden under. But the main thing, I think, for any communications professional from the get-go is to, if you can't be credible, then appear credible. Mm-hmm. So the demand from most business leaders is that they're engaging with communications professionals who at least look like they know what they're talking about. And we've just, I'm in Texas here with Tom, we've just done a presentation of somebody who pitched GDPR services, but called them GPRD services. Mm. So there is a threshold you've got to have to be credible. But assuming you've got through that threshold, I think the 3 big issues for most communications professionals at the moment are firstly transparency. Human nature is that we often like to tell people the good stuff and not necessarily the bad. So let's say, for example, we're looking at marketing a new app. Then we might tell people, the cool features that we think they will like. We might not tell them the fact that we're tracking them everywhere we go. They go, we're selling that data. And by the way, we're also getting battery strength on their mobile phone because we know people pay more when they're stressed because their battery's low. So transparency is always, I think, going to be number 1. Linked to that in some respects is consent. So for most of what we're trying to do with people, we need their consent. We can only have a valid consent if it's what's called full and informed consent. So we've got to be transparent with them. We've got to tell them exactly what we're doing with the data to get their consent. Otherwise, consent isn't valid. As I said, I'm here with Tom in Texas. So I guess it's probably a Texas phrase. If not, it should be. Consent isn't the only horse in the rodeo. You can legitimize what you're doing with data on some other basis. But for most communications professionals, consent is going to be the thing that they're going to rely on to legitimize the use of data. And then the third thing I'd say is look at where you got that data from in the first place. too often, I think, we, as communications professionals, we tend to be almost in execution only mode sometimes. So we might have a co-worker who's been to a conference and they come back with an Excel spreadsheet or 45 business cards with an elastic band wrapped around them, and they say, pitch these people the white paper we've just done, or make sure that they sign up for the webinar that we're doing a week Wednesday. And oftentimes we go immediately into execution only mode without saying, where did you get these business cards from? Or was the conference organizer entitled to give you this list of delegates? And oftentimes, unfortunately, when we ask this question, we find out that, actually, I'm friends with Dave, the conference organizer, and no, they never got consent, but basically I took him for a drink when the conference was over, and I said, Dave, you could do me a real favor by giving me the delegate list, and he said, yeah, sure, but pretend it didn't happen. Or we've got business cards by having, I guess you call it the same, a goldfish bowl. So we've put a goldfish bowl in the middle of the stand. We've said to people, you can win, some meaningless piece of electronic equipment that people didn't want anyway if you put your name in the hat, and we've used that to get leads, and that causes all sorts of other difficulties as well, as to if people enter put their business card in a drawer to get a pair of iPhone speakers, did they really think that they were signing up for you, pestering them until the day they died? So oftentimes we've got to look forensically, I think, at where the list of names is coming from, where the data's coming from that we're sweating. That's obviously the same in a social media environment as well. We've got somebody coming into the organization who says, I've got 1,000 contacts on LinkedIn, let's mail to them. We've got to ask the question whether that's the appropriate thing to do.
That's great.
So Laura, from my perspective and picking up on what Jonathan said, I would say the three key points I would raise are: one, GDPR may apply to you in a way you hadn't thought of. If you have consumer data, you may understand or appreciate fully the applicability of the law to yourself. But if you're a service provider, such as a communications professional, you may not understand that a customer's business card or a potential customer's business card may have GDPR implications. Number two is you have to have a process in place to deal with these issues. If you don't have a process in place, you don't know what rules to follow when this situation comes up, which brings up number three, you have to train your employees. And whether it's yourself researching this so you can explain it to your client base, or you explaining it to others of your client base in a training employees, all employees, and those at high risk of GDPR violations is going to be critical.
Great. That's really great. And so that kind of actually leads to my next question. Say we have, most communicators have clients and they have a whole database with a list. They don't necessarily know where a lot of these names have come from. They've maybe inherited it, or it's gone through processes that are not GDPR approved at this point. What's the best way to move forward for them? What's the best next step? Do they need to get everyone to re-opt in? Or how do they move forward knowing that they probably have a list of unknown origin?
I think this is a truly challenging question. And we, as Tom knows, we run a network for some organizations where they share information on current challenges with us and with each other in a sort of hosted setting. And it's remarkable how you see problems increase, the same problem in multiple organizations. The January problem was, should I appoint a data protection officer? The sort of end of March, beginning of April problem is definitely that. I think a lot of people are doing very poor jobs at trying to legitimize their using old databases. But the regulators aren't really that forgiving on it. As well as GDPR, there is other legislation at play here. And the name of that legislation differs in different countries in the EU. In the UK, it's known as the PECR regulations, PECR. And they are regulations that govern marketing via electronic means. So you've often got to look at PECA and GDPR hand in hand. So to give you one example, and by the way, the UK data regulator is also the regulator for PECA as well as for data protection. So to give you one example, a airline company decided that it wasn't quite sure whether they'd got appropriate consents from people to mail at them, which would survive post-GDPR. So they tried to do a campaign to get those people to re-opt in, as you said. They decided that the response rate was going to be low. And obviously, as communications professionals, you'll have a gauge as to how low that might be, but it might be 2 or 3 or 4% for a campaign to get people to re-opt in. So they decided to try and up their chances by incentivizing the opt-in. So if you opt in and allow us to mail to you after May, then we'll put you in a sweep and you could win a flight, and we cover the following locations and we're a great airline. Now, the regulator said, rightly so, well, that wasn't an opt-in email. It was a marketing email with an opt-in element. And that then comes within the marketing rules because by their own admission, they couldn't prove that they had opt-in consents already. Else, why do the mail campaign? Then the regulators got them in an uncomfortable place. And there have been cases involving the airlines concerned called Flybe, Honda, for example, the car company, Morrison's, that are a retailer. And last time I looked at the regulators' figures in the UK alone, there are about 180 current investigations against people who are trying to clean up their list or do some other form of electronic marketing that doesn't comply with PECA. So that's a really dangerous thing to do. You know, if you're unsure about your database and how you acquired it and whether you got consent, the only safe thing to do is to destroy the list and start again. For most organizations, that's not a step they want to take. So they're going to have to look at a risk-based analysis of how likely they are to get into difficulty. So you can send what I would call love emails. You can send emails to people to say, we love you, we've really enjoyed communicating with you, we want to do that after May as well. Please, will you opt in? So you can do that type of campaign for mostly, as a general rule, but your success rate might not be that high. Usually, of course, it's a reflection of the content that you've previously provided to people. So what, as communications professionals, will want to be doing in the next month is making sure that the next points of communication we have with them are absolutely tip-top. You want to be selling them the best white paper you've ever sent them. You want to be sending them an invitation to the most focused webinar you've ever done in your life, because you're going to be judged on your last 2 or 3 points of contact. If you are going to do a re-opt-in campaign like that, you're going to be judged on your latest work. So make sure that's truly excellent. For some businesses, they're taking the view that actually we're going to do a risk-based analysis and we're still going to use an old list and not ask people to opt in again. We're going to amplify the opt-out. So we're going to put bigger letters saying, here's how to opt out. We might put some wording around GDPR in that. But for most organizations, what they do will be a reflection of the risk they're prepared to take and how good their relationship is with customers already.
And Laura, I would just add that it can't actually, I view it as an opportunity, because if you do, as Jonathan said, and put together 2 or 3 or 4 really top pieces of content, you offer that content with no strings attached. I think it gives you the opportunity to re-engage with your client/customer base in a way that they will appreciate, and it may actually make you take your game up a notch.
That's such an excellent point, Tom. And that's actually something we were talking about internally. I think if anything, this is only going to almost force communicators to do a better job at their email marketing, because if they don't, they have a higher risk. So that's a really good point, and good for everyone to keep in mind. It should be something they are open to and look forward to as an opportunity versus kind of being nervous about.
Yeah, and by the way, I think across the board, I mean, that's a great point. I know it's a cliched thing to say, but we need to narrowcast, not broadcast. That's particularly so in GDPR. So I'll give you just one example. We've done some work with a global telco. They basically create leads for themselves at trade fairs. And traditionally, they've appointed agency staff who happen to have been young, attractive females to stand on the front of their stand, and they've remunerated them by the number of badges they can scan. And as a general rule, when we looked at the metrics, a third of their database from trade shows were students, because a student will hang around long enough to be scanned in exchange for a pen or something, whereas, surprise, surprise, the CFO of GM won't. So we did an experiment where we said to them, okay, GDPR is going to cause problems for that type of activity. So just humour us for one trade show only, replace the contractors with 3 people on the stand who truly know your products. And instead of saying, let's scan you, say, we've got upcoming webinars on these 5 areas. Would any of them interest you? They had an iPad. If so, I can sign you up for them now. Now, what happened on the stand, which is what we hoped happened, is people would say, actually, I'm really interested in VPN. In fact, that's why I'm at the show. I've been charged with seeing the offerings that were available in the market for that, because that's the route we're going down. And so because these 3 people were good at their job, they'd say, actually, we've got a side room at the back of the booth. Do you want to chat about that? So, of course, they got less leads, but they did more business. They signed up people at the show. And their global head of marketing said, we've never signed business at a show in living memory. Why? Because the contractors don't know the product range, and they've replaced them with, I don't judge whether they were more or less attractive, but they've replaced them with people who are more knowledgeable about the product range. And at the end of the day, why are you at the show? Are you at the show to generate leads, or are you at the show to get business? And if it's the latter, then adapt your policy to make sure that you sign a business. Don't just go for leads to sweat.
Right. What are we really measuring? Is it a numbers game, or is it actually something that's going to move your business forward? That's great. That's a really great example. Now, for communicators that own agencies that are often third parties for businesses, are they liable? So, say you're a agency owner and you have a client and they're just not interested in doing anything to help make their list GDPR compliant. Is the third party that is operating the email marketing and email list, are they going to be liable? Can they be fined personally if they're operating an email list for a company?
The answer is possibly. Okay. They're never going to be the first target, I don't think. I think in most cases, there's some technical terms in GDPR which come across from the old legislation, but the data controller would be the commissioner, if you like, so the corporation who's asking the agency to do something. And in most cases, the agency would be the data processor. So in most cases, the primary focus of the regulator will be the corporation, not the agency. However, in some cases, the agency can become the data controller in its own right. So let's say, for example, the corporation said, we want you, the agency, to manage this promotion to win a week in Naples, Florida. But the agency is deciding who qualifies and who doesn't, and the agency is also using the data collected for some other purpose. Then the agency itself could become a data controller and directly liable. So you've got to be clear about your terms of engagement. You've got to, if you're the agency, you've always got to make sure that you're acting on the written instructions of the corporation to ensure that they're picking up the liability, not you. But even if you do all of those things, be aware of the fact that there are various powers directly against data processors. So theoretically, a regulator could knock on your door, ask you for information, ask you whether you've done a data protection impact assessment, although the primary obligation to do that will be on the data controller. And in some circumstances, a data subject, so somebody who thinks they've been affected, somebody who received the communication, can issue proceedings against both the controller and the processor and effectively say, I know one of you was responsible, I don't know which, you just pay me out and you sort that liability out between the two of you. And there's a mechanism in GDPR to allow that to take place. So agencies will not be beyond reproach. And of course, the other critical thing to do is to make sure that you have the right contract in place with the data controller. So if they're giving you data to sweat, you need to make sure that they've got the right to pass you that data in the first place, and they're holding you harmless if there's any issues with that data.
Okay. So, Laura, let me take that in a little bit different direction. Say Laura Petrolino, Tom Fox Energy Company hires Laura Petrolino marketing to do an email list. Laura Petrolino marketing then hires individual contractors to help data mine. In that situation, you may become the data controller, and because of the contract you have with me, you may have assumed a liability that you were not aware of. So if there are companies down the chain from you as the third party, so the fourth, fifth, or sixth party, you may actually have their liability. So you need to make sure that any of your contracting third parties are also GDPR compliant.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a really good add-on. All right, great. That's super helpful. Thank you, guys. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Article 5, which I think has a lot of the regulations that communicators are going to start getting a little nervous about. The two biggest ones that I see are the time limit, so that you're only allowed to keep data for the amount of time required, and that you're only allowed to collect the amount of data required. So a common thing that communicators would do is do something like have a ebook that someone would download, and they exchange their email for the download. They send them the link to the download, and then they get the ebook. And they then move that person to a blog subscription list or a newsletter list or something like that. When they do that, often for the download, they'll ask for, theoretically for the download, all they really need is their email address, but they might ask for demographic or preference or industry information so they can put them on a segmented list to better email them content. Where in GDPR, is none of that compliant? Do they really need to, after someone downloads an ebook, remove the email address because they can only keep it for the amount of time needed? How should they deal with an issue like that?
Yeah, great question. I think the answer, the short answer is it depends.
Right.
What most people are going to do, I think, to be compliant is to do a data protection impact assessment. So they're going to work out exactly why they need the data, whether that's justifiable, and how they're going to protect it. And there's a process, and you can design your own template. There's quite detailed guidance from the Working Party 29, this group of EU data protection regulators, that shows you how to do that process. I'm not going to say it's an easy process, but it's a process that once you've done it a couple of times, you'll get good at it. And you can, subject to certain exceptions, have a fair exchange. You can say to people, we've produced this ebook for free, and as a result, what we'd really like to do is take this data, because then that might help us benefit and recoup the costs of the white paper. You've got to be and you can do that under the existing rules. You've got to be much more cautious about that under GDPR. There are provisions which effectively say that you can't condition the provisional service on the provision of a service on consent. We know that there's at least one threatened class action. It happens to involve a webinar provider, where the webinar provider said, as you say, we need your email address, but we also want to know whether your number of employees are in the following band, et cetera, et cetera. And the individual concerned has said, that's a conditional consent. It's not a valid consent. You're denying me the service because I won't provide the information. So what most organizations are doing is they're looking much more forensically at what do I absolutely need to have as a minimum and what would I like to have. And they're being much clearer at the form completion stage about that. So obviously people will often use asterisks for the must-haves and nothing for the nice-to-haves. We're likely to see color differentials, for example. People will still volunteer data for you, particularly if they think, going back to the original point, if they think your content is so amazing, they will help you out. If your content's average, they won't. So again, get your content as good as it can be. As far as how long you can keep data for, obviously you can only keep data for so long as is necessary. You're right that that's open-ended. If somebody transacts with you, then it's a little bit easier because there are things like limitation periods that you could use. You might have retention obligations for sales tax, for example. But if it's somebody who's just making a simple inquiry, then you might have to delete that data sooner than you have. Most organizations just keep that data in a pot against the day that it might come useful. A lot of communicators have become almost like the cyber equivalents of our grandmothers. My own grandmother would store cans of peaches just in case there was nuclear war. And a lot of communicators are like that. We store cans of data just in case it comes in useful for a future campaign. I think those days have gone. And equally, again, I know a lot of organizations have almost got too much data. If you look at, there are case studies on some retailers, for example, that the data they've got from store cards is so huge a pot that they're not getting anything meaningful out of that data anymore. So some retailers in the UK, for example, are collecting less data, but using it more. And again, it's got to tie into your whole communication strategy. Don't just store stuff up for a rainy day. Take information for a purpose, then use it.
Yep, I agree with all that.
So a question that we've actually had or a comment we've had from a lot of people ever since I posted the article was, well, I'm an American and I only deal with American clients, so I don't need to worry about this. How would you respond to those people?
From my experience, there's a lot of people who say that, and when you drill down, and not a lot of people reach that qualification. So most people who are communicating on a global basis these days. If you're that one website that is only accessible in the US, is only accessible to a US IP address, and you're absolutely sure of that, then happy days. But I think you would be the only organization in the world who does that. And remember that a lot of the case law in this area was set by the US because of prohibitions on online gaming. So to be certain that you're only targeting the US, you're probably going to need at minimum an IP address that pins somebody to a specific area. And even then, that's not necessarily accurate. I used to work for a US law firm. My device was based in London, but it had a US IP address because it was going over their network. And then the other thing I think that's breaking news at the moment is, of course, we're looking at the play out of the Facebook Cambridge Analytica debacle. And if Facebook decides that it is going to commit to ensuring that GDPR applies to all data across the board, then anybody involved in the social media space particularly is probably going to have to meet that bar as well. Because my suspicion would be that if you're going to enter into any form of data exchange with Facebook, because they have said they're going to work on the assumption if that's where they end up, the GDPR applies to that data, then they're going to want you to comply with GDPR as well. So there is probably one or two businesses in, I don't know, Hackensack, who only repair wheels on wooden carts, who won't have to think about GDPR. But I think they're definitely going to be the minority. And I think there is a knee-jerk reaction of people saying it doesn't apply to me. But when you drill down, it does. And they're, in some respects, the most dangerous because they're the people who are taking no precautions at all.
Well, let me just pick up on one of the points Jonathan talked about with Facebook. Where this is going is that the business response to GDPR will be an entire compliance regime around data protection and data privacy. And if you want to play in that business space, you're going to have a GDPR-like compliance policy for data protection and data privacy. It's going to be a market differentiator if you do have one, and if you don't, it may be a market excluder for you. From my perspective, I would say that companies like Facebook will have a business solution to the legal problem of GDPR, and if you don't have that business solution, you're not going to be able to do business with companies that require it from their third parties.
Excellent. Really great point, guys. Okay, thank you very much. All right, last question. You've mentioned risk assessment several times, and I think when communicators hear risk assessment, they get very nervous because they have no idea. They know crisis communications, but they have no idea what you mean by risk assessment. What would you say is the best way for communicators to go about a risk assessment, or a resource that they can turn to that will help them through that process?
We've got FAQs that talk a little bit about DPIAs. Tom and I have done a podcast on data protection impact assessments, which have got 10 minutes worth of tips there. It's one of those concepts that's quite hard to get your head around, but once you've done it once or twice or three times, it becomes intuitive. It's like, I don't know, being taught to cross the road when you're a kid. You start off, let's use the same analogy, let's see if I can stretch it. You start off at the curbside, you're looking at the risks, so you've got to look up and down the road. The data protection equivalent is you've got to do a quick situational analysis. So what data am I holding? Is there a truck that's going to hit that data? Once you've done that, then you're looking at probability. So you're looking at how probable is it that the truck will hit me? I can see the truck. How probable is it that I'm going to expose data by doing the thing I'm doing? So by sharing it with the wrong people, with losing it on a train, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third bit, when you take it to its most simple, is how can I reduce the risk? If I'm crossing the road, I can reduce the risk of the truck hitting me by, I don't know, taking my earbuds out of my ear and listening as well as looking and getting across the road pretty quickly. Equally, from a data protection point of view, you can take protection. You can put appropriate agreements in place with those vendors that Tom talked about before. You can make sure that you're, I don't know, not transferring data to a mail house via unencrypted email, that you're using some sort of secure way of transferring data to them. So it's as simple as almost stop, look, listen, reduce the risk. If you can have a process like that, obviously there are much more advanced processes. The more advanced a thing you're doing, the more detail you'll need. But you won't go far wrong if you adopt that as a basic strategy.
Laura, I just have to add, the lawyer in me says, whatever process you go through, write it down.
Yeah.
You have to document your process, because if a regulator comes knocking and you have made an assessment without documenting what the process you used and how you came to your decision, a regulator will assume you did not do an assessment. So I say the three most important words in compliance are document, document, document. Whatever you do, document it. I don't think you'll be chastised by a regulator if you come to a wrong decision, if your decision was well reasoned based upon a documented evidence trail.
Great. Okay. Super helpful. And I'll also link to the resources that you mentioned, Jonathan, in the blog post. So thank you. This has provided so much clarity for me on this issue, and I really, really appreciate it. As we kind of sign off, is there any other final thoughts that you want to send communicators off with about GDPR and how they should approach this?
Well, you've got about 40 days left. Don't waste your time. Don't sit on your hands. Do something. Tom's exactly right. Regulators like an earnest effort. Even if you've got a fully reasoned decision on a risk you've taken, but you've made the wrong call, I think you will have some sympathy. Regulators won't have sympathy for people who, ignore risk or decide to take it without any assessment of what that risk is.
So, Laura, from my perspective, I would just say GDPR does not say you cannot have a data breach that's a technological breach. What GDPR says is you can't lose your data. And that means if you keep all of your data in a notebook and you lose your notebook, you've had a GDPR breach. Right. So the written word, the hard copy is equally, GDPR equally applies to. So never forget that as old school as you may want to be, with hard copies, if you lose those, that's a data breach.
Interesting. Really, really good point. Thank you both so much. This has been amazing. And I know our community is extremely grateful for everything that you provided to help them out today.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Countdown to GDPR. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast. It was helping our rankings and get the word out about one of the top podcasts in compliance around GDPR. Thank you again for joining this week, and I hope you'll join us again for another episode. Countdown to GDPR is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.